Our first panel is called Ukraine and the EU, the Road Ahead. And so let's begin our first panel. Please welcome to the stage Daniel Szaligowski from Polish Institute of International Affairs, who will chair this meeting. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Daniel Szaligowski. I'm head of Eastern Europe program at PISM. We started the first panel dedicated to the EU-Ukraine relations. So let me welcome to the stage our distinguished guests. Or at the very first, at the very beginning, let me thank to the organizers, because that's not a usual situation in which we will have the panel composed only of Ukrainian speakers. So that's something that really distinguishes this conference from the other ones, and this really deserves a credit, giving credit to the organizers. But let me welcome to the stage Iryna Stavchuk, Ukraine program manager. Welcome. So Iryna is Ukraine program manager at the European Climate Foundation and former Ukraine's deputy minister responsible for climate policy. Maryna Ratushna. Maryna is industrial pollution coordination at the Center for Environmental Initiatives Ecoaction. And Andryi Korniychuk, who is a policy analyst and expert on international relations at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. We will have a video recorded, as I understand, from Oleksandr Vasiuk, a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, at the end of the panel. Yeah, that's the confirmation. Okay, so we'll jump straight away to the discussion, which will be dedicated to the future of EU-Ukraine relations. We are at the brink of Ukraine starting the negotiation accessions. Likely the decision will be taken at the December European Council if hopefully there is the unanimity between all of the member states. So my first question would be I would pose the first question to Andryi. Actually, if you would describe us shortly where we are in this process, how long you expect it would take, what obstacles you expect that Ukraine would face on the road to the European Union, actually what are the expectations down the road from the Ukrainian side?
Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I think, as you mentioned about the Ukraine panelists, one of the changes that the full-scale invasion brought, that you see a substantial increase in ownership and presence of Ukrainians on different panels, discussions. And I think it's sad that it took so much sacrifice for that to happen, but it's important that it has happened. When you take about the process, because we were asked also to be brief, and perhaps I'll also try to be a bit provocative. So
brief is like 3-4 minutes, not 1 minute.
Yes. So I'll try to highlight the few essential things that I think we should remember. So if you ask us about where we are in the process, to my opinion, I think that we no longer should speak if Ukraine joins the EU, but rather when the Ukraine joins the EU. I think the February 2022 changed the paradigm. The destinies of the EU and its member states and Ukraine are almost inherently tied together. For decades. I wouldn't use word forever because it's heavily loaded, and well, you never know what can happen, as we know in these days. But I think for decades these destinies are tied. So we should refocus our attention on understanding sort of the modalities of Ukraine joining, the time frame, as you rightly emphasized. But I think there's hardly anyone except for maybe currently sitting in Budapest or Bratislava who would sort of negate Ukraine's place in the European family. When we talk about when, so obviously the last one who joined Croatia, it took about a decade. If you look at how the Ukrainian authorities communicate, they set the time frame very ambitiously. I have heard several times mentioning 3, 4, 2 years even. To some extent, you could see being surprised. Maybe you can see this ironic smile, whether it's possible. But let's remember that also a lot of people expected Ukraine to fall within 3 days. They don't expect the war to drag for 2 years. And You remember the government 2019, I mean, we all remember who are interested in Ukraine affairs. There was the famous turbo regime or turbo mode, where the authorities, maybe it's an infamous one, if you consider that some of the civil society and important stakeholders were not necessarily consulted in-depthly, but the government has shown that it can deliver in terms of reforms. And I think what we will be discussing today, also looking at how the panels are being shaped, is how you move from that stage where you deliver in terms of community, European community acquis, delivering on a judicial level, to actual implementation and ownership by the society and involvement on important stakeholders. So I think, although it's very ambitious, Ukraine can, so we shouldn't be very skeptic about it. So on a technical level, there's a lot of optimism. But it's very important, I think, to really focus on now what I would like to mention is on these modalities, how we do. I think it's, as Oleksandra mentioned in her opening speech, I think it's very critical what she said. You should not take the process for granted. So, as you know, these end of 90s or beginning of end of history, there are a lot of interesting ideas that we are at the final stage and then we are proven wrong. So I think nowadays we are almost sure that whether it's democracy or basic human rights, it's a constant process, it's a constant grind. You have to constantly work on it. So I think in this case, also for Ukraine, it's so essential to have a process that sets up that future in a proper way. And then we see a lot of principles already mentioned, either it's Lugano Declaration, so that's inclusiveness, involvement of vulnerable groups, etc., etc. So I think in 3 or 4 minutes it's very difficult to mention them all, but that process is key because I think it's also what I don't see emphasized enough. I think there's a lot of fixation on the end result, maybe sometimes even from the Ukrainian side, that we need to join. But I think that the essence of here is to embrace the road to the EU. Because if Ukraine wants to be also a resilient democracy, it's almost as everything in life, whether it's if you do sports, for instance, if you do it for decades, for years, you are on this path. You sort of build your resilience, you build your sort of democratic muscle, and it's less easy for you to lose it. But if you jump through quick, fast-track changes, I don't think that's beneficial. So I think it's important that although Ukraine's path is almost sort of secured or guaranteed, it moved, a lot of people comment, from a buffer state to a border state, being de facto integrated into peace and security, Western peace and security architecture. I think we should increasingly start focusing on remembering how to structure the process. And I think today's conference will give us a lot of ideas on how this should be structured, so Ukraine indeed goes through every steps in a proper way. And whether it's a staged integration or other models, that is very important. And one last thing, and one last moment to mention, because obviously Ukraine can deliver, let's say, in 2 or 3 years. But we know with the Western Balkans, it's still a political decision during the EU. So I think it's critical also to lobby, and Ukrainian authorities are increasingly understanding. So you work with Brussels, but you also should be very savvy, diplomatic, and working with individual capitals. Obviously, they still need to work with the Global South. It's a lot of tasks, but the understanding is there. And also, it's important that the EU itself sort of is not lost in its reform agenda. So it says, so Ukraine knocks on the door, has 1, 2 feet, or say, okay, we are entering, but say, no, the house is not in order, you wait. And then you wait, and then you wait, and you wait. And the same happens. So I think that is also essential to remember that the EU should not be this deepening and widening of the EU discussion that is happening. I think coming from a progressive foundation, which works closely, for instance, with the S&D group in the parliament, there's a lot of discussion that both deepening and widening could be taken in a parallel. So maybe I'll finish on this, I'm trying to keep it short.
Okay, so if someone puts you this date, 2030, you're not saying it's not impossible?
I wouldn't. I mean, Ukraine is almost, let's edit as a commercial. Impossible is nothing. I think Ukrainians have shown that. So I wouldn't be skeptic about it. But of course, there's a lot of variables, and the war, the battlefield situation is perhaps the most uncertain. So yeah, we should always take that into account. But I rather on the optimistic side.
Okay, so I saw this recent report by the Commission. The Commission assesses the preparedness of Ukraine for taking up the obligations stemming from the membership, and it looks like the key problem will be the economic conditions. I mean, there are several reasons for that, but the economic conditions are really turning flashing red in this assessment. So if you look at the scale of problem with Ukrainian economy, then try to find something similar in terms of scale and ambition on the European Union side. I mean, the scale of adjustment that is needed on the Ukrainian side. What comes to my mind is the green transformation. It's something that is really on the same scale of adjustment and ambition. And this is why I would like to ask a particular question addressed to Iryna. Do you think that kind of framework, green transformation, Green Deal, this is something that could be used as a paradigm for future, at least for the time being, for future EU-Ukraine relations, or used to guide the EU-Ukraine relations?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you very much for invitation to this conference, but also let me take this chance to thank the Polish nation for all the support to Ukraine from the first day of the war. And I think this solidarity and this support that was happening on many different levels, it's also one of the kind of transformative values for democracy, for the freedom, for all the emotional part of like where we are, what we are, and why are we here. So thank you very much. On the Green Deal, before the war, Ukraine was actually quite standing forward and taking Green Deal as one of, like, its also core political direction. And during those times, we had a very good negotiations with EU on different areas. And it was also the time when Ukraine has been undergoing update of its climate targets. And actually, it increased it substantially from the 2015 Paris Agreement targets. So there was a much deeper understanding and also willingness on the side of Ukraine from different perspectives, like because that's energy efficiency in buildings, that's more competitive economy, that's stronger energy security if we kind of transform our energy sector. So all those issues were on the agenda and were quite seriously discussed. And when we listen to current kind of political debates and presentations on the post-war recovery of Ukraine, it's also very much kind of build back better, green narratives, and this vision that we want Ukraine to be a modern, competitive state with a stronger economy and be integrated with the EU, which of course also means implementation of all the policies. Of course, there are a lot of challenges how to get there, because because it looks very nice when you look at it as a direction, but when you start working on it, of course, there are a lot of challenges. That's the poverty of Ukrainian population now, when it's really difficult to actually go for more expensive measures, and the state even struggles to raise the tariffs on the market levels, which means a lot of subsidies, but that's like the political challenge. And then, of course, when we have to implement ETS, and especially on the current EU rules, which is phase 4, and there are even debates about expanding it to other sectors, that's a huge challenge. But what we also see in the parallel is, for example, in the energy sector, the transformation is already happening. We have huge developments of decentralized development of renewables for self-consumption by industries because of the energy security, because of blackouts. That's kind of, it's not visible so much, it's not discussed so much, but it's happening on a very big scale. And also there are a lot of requests from municipalities to also develop renewables for hospitals, for water utilities, and there are projects happening, and there is bigger and bigger demand for that. So because of the situation, unfortunately, of the Russian attacks, there is kind of things which were like more difficult or kept by, I don't know, monopoly companies or like by vested interests. It's now happening on the ground because also of the situation, and there are more examples like that. One more thing on the European integration, maybe that like not directed directly
Sure.
to Green Deal. When I look at Ukraine, because I used to work in the civil society organization for many years, then I joined the government, now I'm in foundation. And when I look at 20 years back, so as a civil society, we were like advocating, trying to kind of bring the reforms and changes to the country. And before Maidan revolution, we were actually failing everywhere. Like the government would not care, they would not reply, they would not come to discuss. And it was like we were feeling that we can't get through anywhere. And then after Revolution of Dignity, the situation started to change substantially. So like in these last 10 years, the country has went already a very big path. A lot of people from civil society were in the government, are in the government. The whole system has changed, the whole kind of debates within the country and the political kind of culture is also changing. And like we still have a lot of, you know, like people get upset from some corruption cases, from some reforms being so slow. And of course, like this willingness in society, it actually keeps this moving forward. But the country went through substantial changes, and I'm sure this like very strong willingness of people, not only on the politicians, to change the country, to bring it into order, to have more security, better education, better health system, like to really live in a more organized state. This kind of values and willingness should also like move forward all the reforms and all the processes. And on the government side, like all these 10 years, we had different politicians come in, different parties come in, different presidents come in. But what was remaining unchanged is the direction for EU integration and implementation of reforms. So whoever comes as the minister, they have this agenda, they have the list of the reforms they have to pass, and then like with whatever speed they can do, they try to do it. But that remains kind of as a very strong direction, which is there.
I mentioned the Green Deal for a reason, because you're always trying to buy into some priorities of the European Union, because that means your priorities are in line with Brussels. There are some funds that could be distributed to Ukraine, etc. But whether I'm still not very satisfied with the answer. Whether really Ukraine is fit to fulfill all the conditions stemming from the green transformation. I mean, to what extent Ukraine is ready to do it in the short and medium term? And I would like Maryna to follow up on this question, because if you, we've been also discussing, you mentioned a bit the reconstruction through the prism of green transformation. I found the opinion poll done by Rating Group in November 22nd, so a year ago. And you see the Ukrainian society divided in half. So 48% say reconstruction should take place as soon as possible. I mean, just right now, we need it. And 49% say, okay, it can wait a bit, but let be this reconstruction be, including green energy, including modernization, etc. So is really Ukraine ready for this priority stemming from Green Deal, or it's not so black and white picture?
Thank you for this question. First of all, hello everyone. My name is Maryna, and I am from NGO Ecoaction. And I want to say that my NGO developed principles on which green reconstruction should be based. And one of these principles is that reconstruction should serve needs to Ukrainians and promote sustainable development, and of course in line with the Green Deal. That's why the reconstruction process shouldn't be in a very fast way without any standards. I think the main adventure, as we should talk a bit later about it, is that according to these principles, I would like to say that it will be opportunities to create green jobs in Ukraine during the reconstruction and also develop it. For instance, Iryna has already noted, but I want to also emphasize that the production of renewable energy equipment and energy efficiency building materials. And the data say that Ukrainian-owned building material sectors could provide up to 90% of construction material needed to rebuild residential, not residential, and infrastructure sites destroyed by Russia. And also this will stimulate the local economy. For example, if such enterprises are opened in carbon-intensive regions where mines will be closed, this creates new jobs, and this opportunity will also allow provide domestic market to Ukraine with the necessary equipment for its own energy transition, as well as to work in export to EU. This is my point. Thank you.
Iryna, so okay, assuming that Ukraine has some skin in the game, what is there that Ukraine would bring to the table?
You mean on Green Deal?
Yeah. But overall, I mean, we are assuming that Ukraine would join the European Union at some point. Yes, we're not talking about the framework now. So what is there? I mean, let's say I'm a leader of a country that hesitates. Yeah, we are traveling to the December summit, and you have 2-3 minutes to convince me that it's really worth to vote for.
I would say there are two. I mean, I'm not an economist, so for me, and usually these decisions are so much based on the either economic issues, like do we get the human resources, like people who would come to our countries to work, like what would it, like how another country joining EU would actually, how my economy would benefit out of that, or what kind of projects I can implement in Ukraine. So I'm not an economist. But
what is the advantage of Ukraine?
I think advantage of Ukraine is on different sides. It's a big territory with a lot of economic potential close to Europe. It has educated population willing to live on rules and really on kind of better life, so really willing to develop. It has critical resources, it has agricultural resources, it has a lot of kind of business opportunities which are not developed. And it also kind of, you know, make Europe stronger, because it also would become kind of, bigger, but also I think like the role that Ukraine is playing now for the security of Europe, it also has its kind of tremendous moral value for Europe to work together with Ukrainians. Like they're there to stand for European values, they're there to stand like for its freedom and security, not only for Ukraine, but we all understand that, you know, if Ukraine fails, then we never know where Putin would stop. So that's kind of a approach to work together, to stand through that together, and to help Ukraine to kind of overcome all the difficulties it has. Just few more thoughts on, like, is Ukraine ready for the green development, as you asked? I think nobody is ready, actually, even in EU, for kind of all the goals and ambitions that EU Green Deal puts, because that's kind of what we need to do as humans for resolution of the climate change. But that doesn't mean that all these sectoral transformations are easy to undergo. And each country would have its own sectors where it's kind of very difficult, because it also means to change a lot how we live, how we operate. And as Alexandra said, like many people in Europe don't feel it anymore. They're kind of untouched from very basic challenges that, I don't know, some other people in the world are meeting, and vote on economic grounds, and like how their prosperity changed, but not so much how it's compared to some other people in other parts of the world. So, and I think Ukraine is ready to stand for such challenges. And there are transformations happening, and kind of having the full willingness that the process would go there. We can go into details in some sectors, which is also possible now, but I don't know how you plan.
Okay, so overall, if you would compare Ukraine with countries in the region, for instance, the EU countries, then where does Ukraine stand?
If we look at emissions, like we are not worse than others. But it's also because the economic state of the country is not there. So like people don't have as much cars as people in Europe, or as big and many houses as people in Europe have. So it's also kind of on that direction. If we talk about transformations which already happened or policies which are already in place, that's still a way to go. So we don't have emission trading system, which is very complicated and difficult. We have carbon tax, but it has to be increased. But what I also think is that, like, if we take EU policies that are to be implemented now, specifically on climate, which are difficult, that would be tough. Like being in the war, like economy is destroyed with a lot of uncertainties. But this war also, unfortunately, but what it did, it kind of, the old Soviet legacy in the industry, it's also destroyed now. And that was the major reason why we couldn't pass certain legislation on industrial emissions directive, or on carbon tax, or like on emissions from big industrial facilities. And when we don't have that and we are trying to build something new, then it means like we look at it from a completely different perspective. It wouldn't be like the majority of the industry, which is very old, but the systems would transform, and then implementation could go easier and faster.
Because I was putting you in this difficult position, but maybe unnecessarily, just for all of you to know, if you look at this report by the Commission, that's the first one that the Commission assesses Ukraine's progress. There are only two areas in which Commission says that Ukraine is, on a good stage of preparation, and the first one is external relations, rather not a surprise, and the second one is energy, actually. Assessed as a 4 on a 5th on a scale of 1 to 5. So this is something. This is really an achievement of Ukraine. But I will turn to Andryi now. So to Ukraine and the transformation of Ukraine is one thing, and there is yet another process taking place in parallel, and this is the reform within the European Union. I remember one of the people responsible for Polish negotiations, EU membership negotiations, once told us that trying to enter the European Union is like shooting to the ducks. So you have to anticipate where the European Union will be in a couple of years, and this is the union that you are trying to join, not the union that is there today. My question to you would be, what is the union, or what is the vision of the union that Ukraine would like to join in future? What the changes should happen within the union? What's your perspective on the reform of the European Union that is now being discussed around Europe?
If I may, also very shortly, because I really like your question about how you pitch Ukraine as an asset and not as a burden. So obviously it depends with whom you're trapped in an elevator, whether it's Olaf Scholz or President Macron, because you could, with Olaf Scholz, you could say, look at the DIA application and look at Germany's digitalization and President Macron. But obviously you could start like with Ukraine being considered a security provider, which is now the basis. And I think one of the most capable, innovative, adaptable armies in the world. You could put a lot of emphasis on saying, look how Ukrainians, in a matter of weeks, adapt to different solutions. So that flexibility, adaptability proven on the battlefield in the worst case scenario, which is an ongoing war with allegedly the second army in the world. But in that sense, I think that speaks a case for ability to implement different things. But also, the EU officials themselves mentioned the energy, which you mentioned as potentially Ukraine being this. You can spin it in such a way saying that if you want to move from the questions of strategic autonomy from theory to practice, then you get Ukraine on board. And then you go to defense, autonomy in terms of external relations, but also energy independence, on energy resilience. So I think there's a lot of, obviously, a lot of discussions on Ukraine. I think also that maybe one of the biggest assets is this ability to, maybe not the best word, experiment. So Ukraine innovates a lot, experiments, even if part of the country is being destroyed environmentally, but it has to implement very harsh solutions to have a just and sustainable transition and go out of it. So I think there's ways to really convince, but again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it very often would also depend on individual countries, because if you go to Poland, agriculture, but then again, looking when the war ends, in what state will be the Ukrainian sector agriculture, and whether Ukraine would be an agricultural country in the future or it won't to be. So yeah, but coming to the reforms, to be very open, I don't think there's a very clear vision from the side of Ukraine on what the EU will be in the future, also because it's very difficult to ponder on these theoretical questions when you're waging a war. Certainly, I think the biggest take from this is the ability of EU to meet Ukraine's progress and ambitions with concrete political steps. So again, I think, I guess in Kyiv, if I was sitting in Kyiv or working sort of within the government structures, the essence would be that you do things you need to do, but you make sure that, again, this process of EU internal reform is not taking place for decades. It doesn't lead to stagnation. So obviously there's a lot of discussions now, especially again, as I come a bit from that angle, for progressive political family in the EU, advocating for quick future enlargement, but also like implementing qualified majority voting in external policy. But I think obviously Ukraine would advocate looking at how Hungary hijacks certain processes like sanctions. For Ukraine, I think should be in favor of those solutions that would perhaps move from unanimity in certain policies to qualified majority voting in terms of reforms. Of course, there are also these existential questions on how many commissioners you should have, like those institutionals. But again, I think there's no like a clear vision that Ukraine tries to not even promote, but say that's the only way to go about in the future. I think it's also an understanding that being outside the EU, it can suggest as much as it can. But I think, again, it all comes very much to this essence that the EU should simply be able to adapt and meet these ambitions. And I think all those countries also from the southern enlargement of the Western Balkans, they would perhaps very much agree on that modality. So, because those discussions that if you sit in Brussels, it was very clear for the last years, understanding that the enlargement process as it looked like, it was simply not fit enough to meet the current geopolitical challenges. So you need to change it in a way that you see, this is my personal now opinion, enlargement process as an integral part of the new peace and security architecture for the EU, and not something as a side dish, so something in the main dish. And then, of course, we could probably spend a whole day in a conference on the very technical aspects of how you go about these reforms. But I think, as always says, you need this top agreement, you need the top vision and understanding that indeed we're moving in that direction. And as we know currently in EU, there are certain disagreements whether we should, this is my last word, open the treaties again or keep them closed, and maybe, as my PhD supervisor here in Polish Academy of Science used to say, you should look into the annexes. There are a lot of solutions there. So,
yeah, but I just wanted your short response on that. So there is this, I'm simplifying a bit, these two visions between federal Europe and Europe of nations. And so on this map, where is Ukraine? Or you think there has not been yet proper discussion in Ukraine in this respect?
This is a very good question, actually, and I think it also, well, the biggest issue I think is that because you're a sort of extremely experienced expert on Ukraine, so I think that there was never really in Ukraine a very clear ideological understanding. Also, if you look at the political scene, so that you have clear like Social Democratic Party, conservatives, etc. So I think these concepts are a little bit blurred. But I think that the biggest issue or challenge for Ukraine, also coming into the EU, is definitely this of nowadays, especially that I hear from the nationalist or conservative right side sort of political forces, that if we give in so much to protect our sovereignty, should we give this sovereignty to Brussels? And this resonates very well of some of the comments that we hear also even in this part of for some time. So I think still this is a marginal voices. So in overall, perhaps personally, I would more position on that federal side at the moment, also more constructive, because there's an existential necessity to be the EU and make it a functional. So I guess more people see sovereignty better protected within the EU, a functioning EU. But there are still those voices. They could be waking up, and they will be present. They are saying that indeed, maybe we should scale the amount of the sovereignty we are ready to give up, because we have fought so far. So this was Moscow, and then what we give, if you understand. So I think that is indeed a dilemma, but I'm not sure it's now the best moment to resolve it. Maybe it will happen as soon as the intensity war ends or subsides a bit.
That's actually the good occasion to follow up on what you said. So focusing on short-term needs and situation on the ground. Definitely not talking about the military issues, but reconstruction. This is something that we have at the moment already ongoing in Ukraine. I'm looking for sharp and short responses from Iryna and Maryna. How you expect the EU performance up until now, and what are the priority needs for now? I'm having in mind that the winter is upcoming. We know what the Russians are up to, etc.
I would say that EU is acting super fast from the beginning of the war, and that's extremely, that's actually save us, because EU is able to provide the budgetary support needed, and all the rest of the needs, and is acting and taking decisions very fast. That also comes to some states which usually are very long in taking the decisions. So on that side, I would call it very positively, and I think that they're trying to do everything possible to actually provide the necessary support. When we look at the reconstruction and recovery, and that's of course not the EU task, it's a joint task of everybody, I see that there are kind of some challenges that we as people who work on climate and environmental organizations want to have more. So for example, there is, the recovery is already happening, so buildings have been built, been reconstructed, infrastructure is put in place. And of course, we want it to be planned differently, we want the norms to be updated faster so that it's actually built with a better quality, that the buildings are actually take as alternative opportunities to have renewable energy. And when we look at calculations, economically, it makes sense. So it already makes sense when you build a hospital to put a solar panel on it, because it will be paid back in 5-7 years. But when there are no money and the resources are so scarce on all the sides in Ukraine, in EU, budget needs, the war is ongoing, then of course it makes it very difficult to implement. So there is this kind of struggle to find the ways, and it's not a very easy solution how to plan it to make sure that that we don't lock into technical solutions which would last for years just because we are in such a difficult situation. And I'm now based in Berlin, and I live in a house which was built after the war. It's so horrible. It's actually, I feel it's made out of sand, because I can't even make a hole in the wall. And it was built after the war. So we have a very big expectation to have it much better, but then we have the reality. And I think there is a need to weigh a joint solutions with European countries and companies, because there is this climate task. And we have to find the ways how to fund these additional costs and really how much it is, because for buildings, when we look at European calculations, of course it depends. It can be 10% more. But it doesn't happen. And where are the blocks? Are the European companies, what do they see as a major obstacles to come to Ukraine? We don't have, and municipalities lack any type of, not support, but the systems to develop good projects. They don't have money for that. They don't have expertise for that. And what happens is, we as European Climate Foundation, we supported several NGOs to develop with municipalities projects on renewables, on critical infrastructure. And when they have projects, then they find money. the money can come from other donors. They can kind of have half-half grants and finance themselves. But there is a huge need to support municipalities in development of good projects and plan better, and municipalities are seeking that support. So all of them, like, are trying to reach out, and the question how to organize this horizontal cooperation on all the different types of institutions to make transformations much faster than if you go from the central level, reforms, and these reforms never happen with institutional capacity building. So it's expected to implement the law and things should happen on its own. It doesn't happen. So how to find these kind of horizontal links on all the levels to streamline better planning and better recovery, that's extremely important.
Okay, so lack of money, lack of expertise, and lack of time before the winter comes and before our panel ends. So just short answer.
Very short answer. Also about communities.
Short-term needs for Ukraine. What Ukraine needs now?
As you know, on the 3rd of October, Ukrainian government passed the draft of Ukraine plan to European Commission, and unfortunately, civil society and communities had no opportunity give some comments and haven't seen it. So, and communities are drivers of the reconstruction process. That's why civil society organizations now are preparing letter to German government about next Ukraine Recovery Conference, which will be next year. And we want that this conference will be about communities. So we want that on this conference should provide space for Ukraine communities to share their successful reconstruction stories and challenges they are faced now, as well serve a platform for bringing together business representative, Ukrainian communities, international institutions and European cities, and also highlight on this conference the role of civil society in reforming and rebuilding a more sustainable Ukraine on the way on its EU membership.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I abuse a bit my right as moderator? I think we do have time to get 2 questions from the audience, short questions or short comments, if there are any. You have Maciek Zaniewicz.
Just so it gets recorded, Mateusz Piotrowski, Europa patient. You've mentioned, Iryna, critical materials, which, as we all know, are critical for delivering European Green Deal. I don't know if you know, but Ukraine has huge amounts of the critical materials needed for the green transition to happen, which is, of course, an asset, but also how, and this is an open question to everyone here, how do you think of ensuring that this extraction of critical raw materials happens in a way that benefits Ukraine, produces stable jobs, and does not create a kind of unbalanced relation between the EU, which needs those critical raw materials, and Ukraine, not to feed into a kind of resentment and a scenario we can see, for example, in Serbia, with exploitation of lithium, which the EU uses. So how to make this kind of collaboration win-win situation for both the EU countries and Ukraine as a member or a soon member of the EU.
Okay, so let's grab the second question from Maciek.
Yeah, Maciej Zaniewicz from Energy. So firstly, I had a question, but then you asked this question, so now I have only a comment. It was about also negotiations and reform. Unfortunately, we see that it is tight in the perception of a lot of European countries, and we hear in Poland, for example, that in the perception of Germany, if you want Ukraine so badly in the EU, you have to agree on some concessions when it comes to reform of the EU, including, for example, QMV, which is, Poland is not in favor of this majority voting in the EU, and I have to admit that after some talks with Polish experts from the democratic circle, let's say, so advising the next government, they are not in favor as well. And their perception is that now we have democratic mandate, because we are a democratic country right now, democratic government, so we have the democratic mandate to criticize some bad EU ideas. And this is the perception of Polish new government probably is that it will be a bad idea to have this QMV and whole reform when you have more urgent needs. For example, budget. And here just to ask a question. You mentioned that there is no proper debate about how the EU should look like. My another question is there an idea how European budget should look like and reform of budget should look like? Because right now we are at the level of emotions when we are in favor or against Ukraine accession still, but when we start talking about economies and about budget, it will be much more problematic, because you can have people against Ukraine in the EU. Even in Poland, if you count how much money would go to Ukraine on these budget rules you have now, taking into account the problems of economy and how much agriculture is developed in Ukraine. So my question is there really any idea in Ukraine how it should look like, because Ukraine should be part in this debate of the internal EU reform. Yeah.
So I start fast with critical materials.
Yes, how to make sure that European Union does not exploit Ukraine?
I think I would answer from two perspectives. Like, Ukraine wants economic development, so it has to be organized in a way that some production facilities are also placed in Ukraine, or some joint ventures with Ukraine, so that certain kind of benefits, economic benefits of these raw materials remain in Ukraine. But another aspect is what Ukrainian society wants, and what they want kind of compliance with environmental procedures when these mines are developed on one side, and more transparency in the sector on the other side. So like how the licenses are issued is now in Ukraine. This sector is not transparent. So kind of push from the European Union to make it more transparent, that would actually benefit the whole economy and society in general.
Maryna, any recommendations from your side, additional ones? So Andryi, small piece of advice on
very
reform.
quickly. I think these were excellent questions and remarks, but on that extraction of materials, I've heard also quite theoretical at the moment, but discussions that you can imagine scenarios where people, UK migration model with people being kept in Africa in camps, or Ukraine facing demographic challenges, some migrants moving to Ukraine to extract, there's lots of issues. So I think day one, you should make it very public, and you should keep discussing in transparency checks and balances. And also I think it should be very open that when anti-corruption is being mentioned, and let's recall that when Poland was joining the EU, the same issues of corruption were floating around, the Polish plumber, etc. So they are always somewhere there, but it should be open also on the side of Ukraine, or the European stakeholders should also understand that the corruption can also happen within the European side as well, with huge companies being so much interested to get a grasp of Ukraine, resources, land, people, etc. And the question of budget, I think you just hit the nail on the head with this. But I'm afraid that, so I would say that this would be one of the recommendations also for Ukrainian government, to be very much seeking expertise and get involved in these discussions as early as possible. Unfortunately, I think, but this is very subjective view, perhaps this is happening, but I'm not aware of, I don't think there's still enough expertise for Ukrainians to get very extensively involved in this very technical and important discussions on the legal institutional structure of the EU. But I think if you would mobilize resources, if you would have a government had a very clear idea that we need to start now creating this sort of human resources also to be a member of the EU, and I just read in several instances this was one of the major challenges, saying that there's simply not enough people who are knowledgeable, equipped, skilled to be even on the side of administration, to be having these kind of discussions. So I think this is simply, hopefully, this kind of remarks, they really fall on, not fall on deaf ears, but fall on the list of priority list of recommendations. But the EU also needs to invest to help Ukraine, because where you find, you need trainings, you need individuals to equip for that. So this is just one of those more important things that hopefully we'll be taking on board.
Andryi already mentioned Ukrainian. My bad. Ukrainian political class. I think this. So we will finish now with the video from Oleksandr Vasiuk, member of the Ukrainian Parliament from the ruling Servant of the People Party.
Вітаю усіх учасників конференції. Мене звати Олександр Васюк. Я народний депутат України. Тема цієї панелі – Україна-ЄС. Дорога вперед. Хотів би зупинитися на кількох важливих пунктах, які стосуються цієї теми. Перший – євроінтеграція. Україна робить все можливе, щоб стати повноправним членом ЄС. Ми боремося з російською агресією і одночасно впроваджуємо реформи, які потрібні не лише для вступу в ЄС, але й для кращого життя українців. В умовах війни це непросто, але у нас немає часу чекати. Я член Комітету з питань правової політики і займаюся судовою реформою. За останній рік ми успішно провели судову реформу. Була сформована Вища рада правосуддя, Вища кваліфікаційна комісія суддів. Провели реформу, пов'язану з відбором суддів Конституційного суду. Основним завданням роботи нашого комітету є підвищення довіри громадян до судової гілки влади. Для цього ми на законодавчому рівні спрощуємо доступ до правосуддя, робимо роботу суддів більш прозорою, запроваджуємо електронний документообіг у судах, працюємо над антикорупційною реформою. Ми маємо підтримку від Європейського Союзу на всіх рівнях, і я впевнений, повноправне членство України в ЄС зробить його більш міцнішим. У нас велика країна за своєю територією, з потужним економічним потенціалом, можливостями і, найголовніше, людьми, які бачать майбутнє нашої країни в Європейському Союзі. Другий важливий аспект – це відновлення та відбудова. Для України це можливість залучити найкращий європейський досвід, запровадити інноваційні технології. Це той напрямок, над яким ми працюємо вже зараз, і ми маємо підтримку з боку міжнародних партнерів. Для інвесторів це можливість впровадити сучасні технології в Україні. І тут я згадаю про судову реформу, адже її успішна реалізація допоможе забезпечити верховенство права та справедливість для всіх учасників цього процесу. Я дякую всім присутнім та організаторам конференції за те, що піднімаєте важливі питання, які стосуються України, вдячним країнам ЄС та іншим міжнародним партнерам за підтримку нашої країни на шляху до нашої спільної перемоги.
So with this optimistic note, we are ending the panel on the future of Ukraine relations. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our distinguished guests. Krzysztof, over to you.
Yes, a round of applause was very well deserved. Thank you to all the panelists and to Daniel for chairing this wonderful session. We really did see a little bit of the road ahead for Ukraine and the EU already. And of course, it is impossible to have a European conference on policy and values without talking about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine in the European Union.